Morning, everyone. Welcome to the webinar Publishing to the Web using ArcGIS. So for us, this is the first time we're using Teams, so hopefully it will be smooth, but we may have some teething issues as we go through. So we'll just jump straight into it. So today you've got myself, Andrew. I'm a geotechnical support consultant here at Eagle and based in Invercargill. And joining us today as well is Vodafone. Slightly different layout now from GoTo. So we've got a Q&A tab up the top. So encourage throughout the presentation to go through and put in a question for us, and we'll look to answer these at the end. So today's topics, we're going to look at publishing to the web. So we'll do a bit of an introduction, how we can do it, publishing hosted feature services, publishing tiled services, and images services, as well as 3D services, and how we can look at updating these services. But first off, we're going to start with a question. So in ArcGIS, if you publish services, where do you normally publish to? So you're going to get a web poly notification pop up, hopefully. If you can fill that in and pop it, submit that, would be fantastic. But I'll hand over to Vodafone to talk about publishing data to the web.
Yeah, thank you. Let's see what is coming in. It's very even, Stephen, at the moment still, between ArcGIS Online and ArcGIS Enterprise. We've got a couple of people who are still publishing to ArcGIS Server as a standalone. But yeah, it's pretty even, so that's good because we'll be covering both in this webinar. Here we go, sharing my screen. So yeah, I want to start with publishing data to the web. First, starting off with some reasons, as in why would you publish to the web. So first of all, accessibility, as in you're making data available to other people. Also, your data will be real-time and up-to-date if you update your web services. So compared to sharing a file that is basically out of date as soon as you're sending it. So using a web service, people always look at the same information. And it's also great for data integration. So you can integrate your web layers into web maps and apps, but also in third-party applications. Then also for collaboration, as in if people need to, for example, edit on the same data layer, you can do that using web services. And part of that is the security and access control. So you can define who has access to a layer and what are the capabilities that they have on a layer. Is it viewing only, or is it do people have editing control as well? And there's one thing that is actually quite important, is that every service that you publish is also an API. So that comes into the data integration type of thing, but it also allows you to automate your workflows because you've got that API for your layers. You can talk to that service, so you can request query data, but you can also make updates to your services as well. And then the last one is what some organizations do as well, as in they monetize on the data that they have. They maybe spend time and resources on collecting data and analyzing data. And using services, you can monetize on that by selling it to other organizations that can use those services, all supported by that security and access control. And if we then look at the types of services that we can publish, there's quite a few. So ArcGIS supports a wide range of data formats, from unstructured data, LiDAR point clouds, vector data, 3D, even CAD and BIM data. but also your imagery and your multidimensional data, whether that's multidimensional vector or imagery data, and of course real-time and IoT. And what we can do is we can make services of those data types that can then turn into layers that we can add to web maps or 3D scenes, maybe put them into an app that we can share, or use this to connect to another system where that data is being used or updated. And in ArcGIS, this publishing is powered by either ArcGIS Online or ArcGIS Enterprise. And from the question, we saw that it's being used quite even between you. And in some cases, you can also have a standalone server to publish to. And although there's many similarities between ArcGIS Online and ArcGIS Enterprise, there are some differences as well. And I want to highlight one that relates to the publishing. And that is about where your data lives or can live. So ArcGIS Online is a full SaaS solution. So it's managed by Esri. And that also means that when you publish data to ArcGIS Online, all your data will be moved to ArcGIS Online. And from there, the service will be created, but ArcGIS Online, Esri will manage the way that the databases work on the backend or the file servers work on the backend, so you don't have to worry about those. With ArcGIS Enterprise, you can also push your data into the ArcGIS Enterprise as hosted layers. But there's also the option to register your data. So if you have an enterprise geodatabase or a connection to a cloud store or a data lake, you can create a service without moving the data. So you just reference the data where it already sits, and then make it available as a web service and use it in maps and apps. And before we jump into some of the how-tos of publishing the different types of services, we've got a question, and for that I'll pass it back on to Andrew.
So the next question that we've got, again, will come up in Polly. But in ArcGIS, if you publish services, what type of services do you publish?
Yeah, and multiple answers can be given here, because we don't always just publish the one service.
So from that question, you can see the amount of services there are. So this webinar, there is a lot of content for us to cover. So we are going to sit at quite a high level, and hopefully there are some little nuggets of gold throughout the webinar for you. But yeah, feel free to pop those questions through too.
So feature services are quite popular, but we also have image services and scene services being published, and also some vector tiled and raster tiled services, and the good old map image services as well.
See a couple of geoprocessing services as well.
Yeah. All right, thanks for filling this out.
Right, so carry on to Vodafone talking about how to publish feature services.
Radio. All right, yeah, so let's start with the feature services. And first of all, what is a feature service? So basically it allows you to share your vector data, your points, lines, polygons, but also your tables to be published to the web so other people can use them without having to download the data. And a feature layer can have a variety of capabilities. So first of all, it is to view and query the data. So just making it available, you can see it on the map. But then there's also capabilities that you can enable that allow you to edit the data. And that can be just the attribute data. So you're doing inspections and you need to update certain fields in your data, or the geometry, as in you're collecting a new feature, or you're changing the geometry, something has changed location. And then another option is that you can use it for offline use. So what I said is a layer on the web is always up to date, but there are occasions where you need to go out in the field and where you may not have coverage, and you can actually download that data and then sync it back at a later stage when you're back in coverage. So publishing feature layers can be done through a variety of ways. The main one probably is ArcGIS Pro. So in ArcGIS Pro, you can set up your layers and then publish them to ArcGIS Online or Enterprise. But there's also ways in the portal where you can create a layer from scratch or using a template. You can also upload a file, so that can be a GDB or shapefile, but also CSVs with locations or addresses, GPX, GeoJSON, and then publish those as a feature service. There's also something called ArcGIS Solution, and that can be a solution for inspecting fire hydrants, for example, or setting up your tree management solution. And when you deploy those layers and maps and apps usually are being published as well, that you can then fill with data. There's also apps that publish layers. So if you're creating a Server 123 form and you hit publish, then it will actually publish a feature layer to capture all of the responses. The same for the Field Maps Designer, where you can design your when you're designing your questions, it will actually create fields for those and publish them as a feature layer. And one key one is Python as well. So all across the system, the ArcGIS system, you can use Python, and also for creating and publishing layers, but also for managing them. So making changes to them, but also updating the data using Python. And I want to go over a couple of ways that you can share your services. And the first one is from ArcGIS Pro. So if you open up ArcGIS Pro, you've got that share ribbon, and in there you've got share as a web map and share as a web layer, and we'll go over the small differences between those. But you can also share single and multiple layers from the map using the context menu. But before you publish, quite often what you do is you set up your data schema. So you define field names. It's probably a good place to set up the alias as well and the field types. You can create domains, you can set the symbology, the visibility range, as in when is a layer visible from what zoom level. You can also add metadata to your layers that will then be shared to ArcGIS Online when you're publishing. And a good thing to prepare as well is your data. So for example, if you have very big polygons with many hundreds of thousands of vertices, that is probably not going to perform well on the web. So you may need to simplify those or dice them up so they're a little bit smaller. And also in ArcGIS Pro, you can create attachments. And it's best, I always think it's best to do this as close to the source as possible, because most of these things, as we'll see later on, you can also do on the web. But if you're preparing it in ArcGIS Pro, it's probably best to do it here. So if you need to republish, you don't have to go back to the web and reset all of those settings again. And just one note on the attachments, because it may be a little bit hard to find, but if you go to the feature class properties in ArcGIS Pro, you can right click it and go to the properties of a layer, and you have the attachment checkbox. So if you check that one, it also adds the global IDs, and it will then create a relationship class and a table that will hold your attachments. And then if you publish that layer, the attachments will be enabled. You can also do that after the fact. So if you publish it without attachments, but you do need them, for example, for your field work where you capture images of the inspections that you're doing, you can turn it on in the item details as well. You have to go to the layer, to the specific layer that you want to have attachments enabled for. So one of the buttons is sharing as a web map. And what that does is it will publish a web map to the portal, and it will also publish all the layers as services. And you can select the configuration. So you've got exploratory, editable, and visualization. The first two will create feature services for the supported layer types. The visualization will create tiled layers because they are fastest for visualization, but they don't have all the capabilities like editing and filtering. An interesting one is here, if you publish as a web map, it will only publish the layers that aren't surfaces already. So for example, if you use a base map in your web map, it will just reference that base map and it won't try to republish that. Also, all the layers that can be published as a feature surface will all fall under one feature surface with sub-layers. However, you can split them out, and that can often be a good thing, because in this example, we've got schools and school enrollment zones. You can add them to one feature surface called NZ Schools, for example. But then every time someone adds that layer, it will add both the schools and the enrollment zones. And you may want to split those out. And then in the next step, you can set the settings for each of the feature layers. So whether editing is enabled, whether sync is enabled for offline use, and if others can export the data into different formats. A very similar, but a slightly different way is that you can share as a web layer. And basically what that does is similar to the web map. It will share all your web layers, but it won't create the web map. So all of the layers that are in your ArcGIS Pro map will be published as a feature surface. And then again, you go through the settings for the feature layer where you can set the configuration for that feature layer. You can then hit publish and it will publish it up to ArcGIS Online or ArcGIS Enterprise. And the way that I catch myself doing most of the publishing is actually through the context menu. So in here, you can just right click a layer, hit sharing, share as a web layer, and then that sharing screen comes up for just that layer in your map. You can also select multiple layers and then right click the sharing, or another option, if you need to create a feature surface with multiple layers, you can also create a group layer and just share that group layer using the right click, the context menu, and then using the sharing. So this is how I think the bulk of services are published. But another way is that you can create them from scratch in the portal. And to show that, I'll pass it on to Andrew.
Cheers, Bowden. Creating a layer from portal. So what that means is we can create an item, so in ArcGIS Online. Here we've got the different options that we can create an item in ArcGIS Online. So going in the content panel, click on new item, and we get this option here. We can also do this in Enterprise. So note here, there's some slight differences, and it's purely because of the licensing. So obviously in the example ArcGIS Online here, I've got imagery layer and the rest of function template. If I wanted this functionality in Enterprise, I'll need image server. But also note in Enterprise, you have the option as well for a data store, for use and managed data store. So that's like Enterprise geodatabases. So what I'm going to do is go through a real high level of how we can create a feature layer. And then I'll do a wee bit of a live demo on some of the functionality that we can do in our web interface. So we've got feature layer, and we get the different templates here. So we can define our own layer. So that's building from the ground up. We want to define the whole schema and everything. We've also got select an existing feature layer. So say we want to use an existing feature, but bring in the schema. Also to note with this, if you define your own layer, it would default the coordinate system to be the web Mercator. If you're wanting to use NZTM, you'll need to either use select an existing feature layer or use a template that has NZTM as a coordinate system, and it will bring that through. If you don't, it will just bring through the web Mercator. For this example, we're just going to use a existing template, and we're going to use an existing one called the fire hydrants. From here, we can see that it's the point layer, and these are the fields that we've got. We can't change the field at this stage, but I'll walk us through that in the demo. Again, we can add GPS metadata fields. So if we're using field applications, for example, like Quick Capture, we might want to record that information as well as enable Z values. But for the purpose of this webinar, we're not going to worry about that here. We also notice that with the tags coming through when you're creating a new item, it'll bring that through from the template. So we can also go and change the title and add other metadata fields to the summary as well. So before we jump into feature layer views, I've gone through that process and here is my layer. So you can see the tags and everything coming into the metadata. But what we can do is if we go to the data field and go to fields, we can actually customize some of the fields here. So I'm going to add a new field and call it hazards because we want to start recording data for hazards around our fire hydrants. And we'll leave that. We might expand that out to 500 because we want some text along with that. And we can add a new field. So from that, we have now seen that the hazards has been added. We can also see the different tiles. So we've got attachments. We can have attachments added as well. But if we go into the field, we can actually see that we've got list of domains here. So we can add domains to fields in ArcGIS Online as well. But we can also edit existing ones. So for example, this one here, list of values, false and true may not be as clear as what we want it. So we might go change that to simple, no, and yes. Because how the field's configured, the code is stored as a 1 and the 0 as an integer, so I can't change that, but I can change the label that will come through. I can also reorder the domain and I can save that. Because the template that I brought through was American, we've got gallons per minute, gallons per minute. I might want to change that label to go litres per minute. Again, relatively easy. And I also might want to add a series of domains as well here. So we might go 50, 100. And you can quickly build up your data set. The next thing I'll show you, and we'll touch on this a bit later on in some of the scalability to higher demand feature services. But for here, we can have a look at the feature layer. We can also enable sync here. Take note of the cache control. We'll go into this a wee bit further, but note that this is only available when it's shared to the public. And I can save that. So once I've got that set up, what I'm going to show you is what is quite a powerful tool, and it's create a hosted view layer. So I'm going to walk through that process now. And what we're going to do is we're going to create a view to make this data available for public. So we're going to move from the States to little old New Zealand over here. I'm going to select that layer and go next. So now we're going to define our view. So we've got a few options here. We've got an add filter, so we can filter out specific data based on an expression or a domain if we wanted. We can also do an area of interest. So for example, if I only wanted the South Island, I could create a filter to only display results in the South Island. But for this scenario, we're wanting fields. So I can go through and identify fields that I want to see. I want the public to be able to see where the fire hydrants are, but they don't necessarily need to know when like maintenance is required, or the facility ID. So I can remove these from the view. I might leave headers there because it could be a good use case if for people to be aware of. But for the idea there, and we'll leave that there. When I'm happy with that, I can go through and go next. So what this will do is the view will create a item in ArcGIS Online or in Enterprise, but in ArcGIS Online, because it's referencing the fundamental or the underlying hosted feature layer, it won't use additional credits, which is something to note. I'll create the view to be public, and I'll click create. So this will create a layer that I can use for public consumption. It hides some of that private information or information that I don't want to be shown to the public. And I could also do the similar process for my field staff. So I can go in, get them to fill out the fields that they need. I can also share this to public, so I can change the settings of the view. And I can also enable, so editing's turned off and sync's turned off. So because it's going to be public, I don't want people to edit it, and I don't want sync to be enabled.
Hey, Andrew, I think I just took over your screen by accident, so you may need to reshare that if you're still showing things.
No problem.
I wasn't trying to push you.
No problem. Is it hinting I'm taking too long? Sweet. So I'll go back into that one. Sorry. So in the settings tab here, we can editing's turned off in this view because we want it public and we want enable sync turned off. If I go back to the feature service, I can go to the settings here and see the editing enabled, so it's independent from each other. Cool. So feature layer views. So what are they? They're views of data. You have one source of the truth, and it's tailored to a target audience. So in the example, we had public reporting or public people viewing, but we also might have internal staff editing the data. So once that the data has been edited by staff, it would be available for public viewing. So it streamlines those processes. We don't need to have scripts or other processes to copy data across the different feature layers. We're using that one feature layer. And a good thing to note in ArcGIS Online, they don't consume additional credits because they're referencing that primary feature layer. So with that, I will hand it back to Vodavane to talk about publish image services.
Thank you. Yeah, so real powerful, those feature layer views. But let's talk about a different type of surface now. And those are image surfaces. So first off, what are they? So an image surface allows you to make your raster data available as a surface. So whether that's a raster dataset or a mosaic dataset, you can publish that out. And it allows for something very powerful, and that's on-the-fly processing using raster functions. So for visualization or analysis, what it does, it gives you access to the actual cell values and the different raster bands that may be available in your imagery. And that makes it a great input for analysis, for example. Also, you can turn on the download capability if people need access to the underlying data. And the thing to note is that in order to publish an image service, you need to have ArcGIS Image Server for ArcGIS Enterprise, or the ArcGIS Image for ArcGIS Online user extension to be able to publish those types of services. So publishing them can be done from ArcGIS Pro or from the ArcGIS Enterprise portal or the ArcGIS Online portal. And I want to take you through a couple of the workflows for that. So first of all, in ArcGIS Pro, and then publishing to ArcGIS Enterprise. So one key thing to note here is that instead of using the publish web layer, you go to the catalog pane. So where your databases with your Mosaic dataset or your folder with your rasters, and you right click and you can publish from there. Then when you're publishing to ArcGIS Enterprise, you have two options. So what I said before, as in you can have all the data being copied to the server, to ArcGIS Enterprise, or you can use registered data. So that can be something that is on a shared folder, or maybe something that is living in a cloud store in Azure or AWS, for example. So that data can live basically anywhere that the server can reach. Another way of publishing in Enterprise is that you can actually go to the portal. So for users, this is a very easy way to publish an image service. So what you can do is you can add a new item and then choose the imagery layer. And from there, you can select the configuration that you need. So you can just publish one image or a Mosaic image or an image collection, which is similar to a Mosaic data set. Or you can publish multiple imagery layers. So that creates a layer for each image that you upload or reference. And in the next step, what you can do is you can select the raster type. So there's a whole lot of raster types available for the different sensors that can read the metadata. For example, from different satellites like Sentinel or Maxar satellite imagery. And what you can do as well is here, you can select the input imagery. So you can upload imagery from something that you have on your computer to the enterprise. But you can also connect to a data store, and that can be a shared folder or maybe a cloud store that you can see on the bottom right image, where we're connecting to an Azure Blob store, where we can select the images that we want to share. And then the next step is just give it some item details, and it will create that layer, either uploading all the images or referencing the images from the location that you set up. So for ArcGIS Online, it's a little bit different. So you can publish imagery from ArcGIS Pro to ArcGIS Online. For that, you go to the imagery tab, and there's a create hosted imagery button there. And that will basically take you through a wizard that is similar to what we saw before. So you point to the data. And then that data will all be uploaded to ArcGIS Online. One thing to note is that you can actually have a Mosaic dataset that references data in the cloud, but as soon as you publish it to ArcGIS Online, it will download the data from the cloud store and then push it into ArcGIS Online. Like I said, the steps are pretty similar to how you publish it in ArcGIS Enterprise. There are a few things that are different to be aware of. So, like I said, all your imagery will be uploaded to the cloud, so you can't reference data that is stored somewhere else. And you have the option to choose between a dynamic and a tiled imagery layer. And very brief, the tiled imagery layer draws faster, but it doesn't allow for server-side rendering or dynamic mosaicing, but it does still give you access to those pixel values and different bands. And then a dynamic image service can only be shared within the organization. So those are some things to be aware of. For the rest, the publishing workflow is pretty similar to what we saw for ArcGIS Enterprise. Then I want to talk about another layer type. And we often get the question, I've got imagery and I need to publish that. Do I need image server? Well, you don't always need image server. you can create a hosted tiled service for it, and that is mainly if you want to use it to provide context. So if you're creating your own imagery base map, for example, and you don't need it for analysis, you can actually create a hosted tiled service instead of an image service from your imagery. But it also works for vector data or a combination of raster or vector data. And what it does, it basically creates a case. It pre-creates images or tiles, so it will visualize very fast. And there's two flavors of them. So you've got raster tiled layers and vector tiled layers. So let's talk about the raster tiled layers first. Because what they do is they create an image case. So they basically create all these small images for different scale levels. So the user is served with the images real fast. And it supports raster data or vector data. And one use case is if you use very advanced symbology that isn't yet supported in ArcGIS Online as a feature layer, but it is supported in ArcGIS Pro, you can actually case that. You can't change them after it's cased, but you can use that advanced symbology. And what we see, it's often used for base maps. Now that vector tiles come in for topographic type maps, usually it's a vector tile, but for example, for imagery maps or hill shape maps, we use raster tiles to publish them. And then there's a couple of ways that you can publish them. So again, the workflow, that's why we don't go into detail, similar to feature services. You can, but a few differences is that you can actually create them from a hosted feature layer. So if you have a hosted feature layer in your portal, you can select create a tile layer from this. You can use the share web layer workflow in ArcGIS Pro, or use the geoprocessing tools. And that is great because it allows you to automate your workflows as well. So for raster tiles, you use the managed tile case to create the case. You can use the export tile case if you want to create a tile package, so a TPK or TPKX that you can then upload to ArcGIS Online or ArcGIS Enterprise using the share package tool. The other flavor are the vector tiles. They're not that new anymore, but they're definitely newer than the raster tiles. And what it does, it doesn't create images, but it creates vector tiles. It's an optimized format to quickly visualize vector data. And it only supports vector data, so you can't use a raster input in a vector tile. And although it has a lot of symbology and label settings, it's a bit limited compared to what you can do in ArcGIS Pro. In many use cases, it can suffice, but there are situations where you may miss certain symbology options. Key benefits are that it's very small. So, for example, the whole of New Zealand, we can our base maps is being cased under 800 megabytes, whereas the raster tile for New Zealand is a few hundred gigabytes. And another key difference is you can make style changes. So you can change the way that tiled layer looks. So for example, the base maps that we publish for New Zealand, we have one tile case, but we have different styles that creates the canvas base maps, the topographic and the navigation maps. So again, you can publish them from hosted feature layers or through the share web layer workflow in ArcGIS Pro. But again, you can also use the geoprocessing tools. And the steps there are, you can create a vector tile index, and that makes the vector tile smart, that it doesn't case all the way down, but it stops as soon as it basically has packaged all of the vertices for that area. You can then create a vector tile package and share that package to ArcGIS Online or ArcGIS Enterprise. So those are some of the options to publish your layers as tiled layers. And now we're going to add an extra dimension. For that, I'll pass it on to Andrew again.
Perfect, thanks, Boudewijn. So now we're going to jump into publishing 3D scenes. So 3D scenes, so what are they? Well, web scenes are cached web layers that are optimized for drawing large amounts of data in a 3D content. So we've got point cloud, which provides fast display of large volumes of data, and so that will be like your LAS files. Then you've got your 3D points. So that's your point features. So, for example, if you've got a whole heap of trees locations, you can then visualize them in a 3D setting. You've got your 3D objects, that sort of exterior of buildings or modelled. Then buildings where you can bring in your BIM data from either Revit or IFC and visualize that. And that's probably more for more complex buildings. Then we've got voxel layers. So voxel layers, for any of the gamers out there, simple explanation is like Minecraft. But what they are is a multi-dimensional visualization. So the likes of the file types NetCDFs would be an example where they would display volumetric 3D or 4D data. So we could do atmospheric or ocean data as well as geological. So you could have soil levels, for example, at different depths. Here's an example of a voxel layer setup. So yeah, as I said, very similar to Minecraft. And then you've got your integrated mesh. So that's the data sets that's photogrammetry, so coming out from your drones or other sensor-based processes, and a way to visualize. So how do we publish? So all scene services begin inside ArcGIS Pro. That's the fundamental. You'll add your content to Pro and then you'll share as web layer, as Bodabane's previously shown. But there's 4 different workflows and it will depend on what type of 3D scene you're trying to publish. So for example, if you're doing multi-patch points or building data, you'll publish that to your from Pro, and you'll get a scene layer, but you'll also get a related feature layer. So that related feature layer, you can edit some of the data associated with that. Then if you're using the LAS data set for the point cloud, you'll get a scene layer, but it's only view only, so you can only view that LAS data set. Slightly different is the voxel layers. So when you publish a NetCDF data set, for example, you will get what's called a voxel scene layer. And then fundamentally, probably the most common package is creating a scene layer package. So there's a couple of ways you can create scene layer packages as well. So obviously you can create it in Arc Pro, but Esri also have other software that you can create it in with the likes of ArcGIS Drone to Map. So your imagery data, and you can create the scene layer package within there, as well as ArcGIS City Engine as well. Just to note, here in the configuration tab, there's slightly different around the caching. So you can cache locally. It's more sort of identified for server, so you'd leverage your server capabilities there. But and if you're published to online, you'd be caching online. So I mentioned in the demo about preparing for highly scalable services. So this is a key consideration, especially when public viewers are concerned. So we've all probably seen the likes of the John Hopkins COVID dashboard. So how can we prepare our data for public consumption? So there's some key fundamentals here to look at. So in those feature layers, turn off editing is disabled and disable sync. What that will enable is that caching will happen, and we can increase the cache control. So what I highlighted before when it's shared to public. So what that means is it's less requests to the REST service because the data is already loaded and doesn't have to check every time to load more data. So if editing is enabled and sync is enabled, it's got to grab that information or check every time. The other key aspect is no filters. So turning off or don't use filters, use those feature layer views. They're fundamentally now a key process for their highly scalable services. Also, need to consider for your data considerations. So look to use those toll services for large complex data sets, especially if it's view only. You can enable pop-ups on your tiled layer and include attribute information if you need to as well. But another key one is, what about dashboard and apps? So again, similar principles there can be applied. For filtering, stay away from the spatial method. So instead use the field method. So you might have to change your data sets to allow for this. Spatial filters require a lot more requests and are generally a lot slower for large amount of requests compared to an attribute filter. So look, stay away from spatial. As well as relative filters, so especially around dates. So don't use filters like 30 days from now. Use an actual attribute in the table rather than the relative. There is a good blog, and I highly recommend. There is also a presentation from Esri on this, and it's an hour long of just looking at how to highly scalable services. So I've given a brief overview of the key things there, but if you want to know more, I highly recommend checking out this blog and the video. Now I'll hand back to Bodavane to talk about keeping the services up to date.
Thank you. So once we've published our services, data sometimes changes, so we may need to update the data in those services. So I go over a couple of strategies that you can use to keep your services up to date. And I'll start off with the feature services. And there's a couple of ways. So first of all, you can just use geoprocessing tools. As in those geoprocessing tools can use a service as an input, so things like truncate to delete all the data from a feature layer, append with the option to actually update existing fields and only add new fields, can all be done from ArcGIS Pro on services. You can also manage your feature layer, so you can add and remove fields or use the field calculator. So after you added a field, you may need to calculate that field. You can do that in ArcGIS Pro on your feature layers. Another way to update it is to override your feature layer. So again, in the web layer drop-down box, you've got the override, or on the context menu, the right-click, you can override a web layer. What is good to note here is that it will override almost everything. So the ID stays the same, but things like pop-ups will be overwritten, symbology, your data. So if changes have been made to the data that aren't reflected in your ArcGIS Pro data set, they are being overwritten. And also the schema. So if your new data set has a different schema, it will override that schema on the feature layer as well. Another way is that you can go to the portal, and there have been some changes recently in some of the latest updates of ArcGIS, where you can actually update the data. So you can add features, update features, add and update features, or override the entire feature layer, and that is just replacing the data behind it. So you're not making changes to any of the settings that you've done. And one of the favorites of mine is one that came out not too long ago, and that is the ability to switch the source of a feature layer view. So Andrew talked about being able to create a feature layer view on your feature surface. What you can do is tell that feature layer view to look at a new surface. So you can publish your new data and then tell the feature layer to swap over to that new layer. And there's some benefits to that because so some of the things are minimal downtime, as in the switch is almost instant. You've got the ability to QA and QC the new published layer but also if after making the switch you find that something isn't quite right, you can roll back by switching it back to the previous one. And it also allows for updates to the schema if you wish to do so. So for example, you can add a field to your new layer and then tell the feature layer view that that field has been added. So it uses that new field as well. So a real powerful way of updating your layers. Then you can also update tiled surfaces. So hosted tiled surfaces, raster and vector, and scene surfaces. In ArcGIS Pro, you can use the replace web layer tool. So you can upload a new version and then use the replace web layer to change the data behind the surface. So the surface will then look at the new data. Nothing changes to the surface, but the data is being refreshed. And that is something you can do in the portal as well. So going to that item, to that tiled layer, you've got the replace layer button, and it will ask you what is the new layer and how do you want to archive your current layer. And again, this is as minimal downtime. Also, you can QA and QC the new layer that you've published, and you can roll back to that previous version if something didn't go quite right. So there's one thing with scene layers that you can do, but that only works if you publish a scene layer with a feature layer attached to it. And what you can do is you can actually edit that feature layer that is attached to the scene layer. So you can change the attributes that can also define what the symbology is, or you can change the geometry. For example, in this in here, I created a nice tower from what was a small building. That isn't directly reflected in the scene layer because that is a cased version, but you can then go to the portal item and manage the case. So you can rebuild the full case or just certain layers in it, or you can do a partial update where it looks at what geometry has changed, what attribute has changed, and it will only update those features in the case. So then it's visible in the scene layer as well. So those are some strategies to keeping your layers up to date, which is an important side as well. And with that, I'll pass it back to Andrew because we're going to talk about some of the resources, as this was just a high-level overview.
Thanks, Boudewijn. So yeah, like I said, a lot of the content that we've provided today was very high level. Just about every subject we talked about. There's probably other videos Esri have put out. There's blogs, and there's also the documentation. So, for example, the scalability blog, fantastic resource, and the documentation also backs it up. So, if you're looking at the enterprise.arcgis.com, the pro arcgis.com, and doc.arcgis.com for ArcGIS Online. Are fundamental really for finding out the information in today's webinars. But strongly, if you've got any questions on any of today's content that you want us to go into a wee bit further, please flick that through the QA. I noticed, by the way, we've got one sitting there at the moment. Upcoming webinars. So we've got another series continues. So take control of your field operations with Clarion on the 26th of October. ArcGIS for Health on the 2nd of November. You can join Boudewijn back here again on the 16th of November with exploring ready-to-use content in ArcGIS Online for New Zealand. And at the end of the month in November, we've got What's New in Local Maps. So QA, I also want to say thank you very much for attending today. That's been good.
Yeah, we have one question here. I answered it in the comments, but it may be good to reiterate it here. So when I talked about sharing the feature layers, you can actually select layers in your content pane and then right-click to share them as a web layer. And the question is, will that create one feature layer with sub-layers? And the answer is yes, it will create one feature layer with those as sub-layers. So if you want to share them as separate layers, you have to go through the sharing process for each of those.
So we've got another one there as well for swapping the feature layer view source. Is the capability also there for joined view layers?
That is a good question. And we'll have to get back on that at a later point. I know Kaz will ask the question, so we'll get back to you on that. So if there are no more questions coming in, then I want to thank you all for joining this webinar and hope to see you all soon in one of the upcoming webinars.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you very much. If you do have any questions, follow-up questions and stuff, here are our details as well. So you can flick us an email if you do have any questions about anything that we covered today. But otherwise, we might finish up there.